Just do it! Don't let your dreams be dreams. Yesterday said tomorrow. So just do it! Make your dreams untrue!
Hello, and welcome to Screen Tones, where we talk anything and everything webcomics. Today, we're going to be going fishing for webcomic readers. For a successful fishing expedition, it's important to have a good hook, which is what we're going to talk about today. I am Verathane, my pronouns are she, they, and I make the webcomics Tiralt and Witchwood.
I'm Claire, also known as Clam. My pronouns are she, her. I make the webcomic Phantom Marine.
I am Crispy. My pronouns are she, they, and I make the webcomics Ghost Junk Sickness and Lunar Blight.
So, a story's hook can be a little difficult to pin down. It's that chemical X, that plot point, that character dynamic, or quirk, or memorable world-building factor that really grabs a reader and makes them keep reading.
Marketing will often discuss a hook as it relates to crafting a logline or elevator pitch for advertising purposes, but we're going to be focusing more on these moments in storytelling that makes readers go from, I'll give this a chance, to, oops, I can't stop reading.
So let's dive in. To get things started, I think it'll be fun if we kind of talk about our own stuff. So what is the hook of your story? How did you work it out? And was it planned or a realization after the fact?
My hook absolutely changed because I added an entirely new prologue to Phantom Marine about 4 or 5 years after I started it. So it still has the same feeling of a hook. Like, there is a princess and she is dead and she is dealing with essentially her world's equivalent of Satan, and that's interesting. But I had to kind of move at least a little bit of it forward in time, just a tiny bit. Like, it's not too different, and I don't think anybody is still super hooked in the first like 5 pages as they are maybe the first like 30. So it's, in the end, it changed a little bit, but it's still the same kind of thing. It's just structurally, like, I had to just extend it forward a little bit. And yeah, I always wanted that sense of, like, initially you're getting dropped into the story and you're like, what's going on? I don't know what's going on. And the mystery was kind of the hook. But for several people, that turned out to not be the case. It was more of a hindrance because they suddenly had to figure out a bunch of things that were happening all at once. So moving it a little bit forward, giving a bit more context. I don't know if the hook is necessarily, very different, but it feels a little bit different. And now I think people do, just because there's more pages to draw from now, I think certain people, they will say that a different page or a different panel hooks them, which I think is interesting. Like, they're part of the same package, but a little different. So yeah, that's how it is with Phantom Marine.
So it's not all Jeff.
It's not all Jeff. For some people, it's the fact that Phaedra gets shot in the chest with an arrow, but for other people, it's like the same as before. So it's fascinating to see where some people are like, "No, I liked it before," and other people are like, "This is much better." So curious stuff.
I mean, I always think of, like, my first time reading Phantom Marine, years ago. Oh, I could say that now. Anyway, sorry. Webcomic time.
I'm ancient.
And it was always like that promise of the duel between, a dead princess and a death god. And I was like, oh, well, shit, this is cool. So, I mean, like we were discussing, it kind of varies for everyone. And it's interesting to hear what keeps people there. And so it's interesting, it's cool, but it's also very frustrating as a writer to kind of be like, but what does keep you here? How did you get here? How do I hone that kind of thing? So hooks are difficult to kind of get, I guess.
Because the answer can be so different from person to person.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's you can do your best with something that you think is obvious, but then somebody else will be like, "Oh yeah, I started reading because I really like the design of the cat in the
Yeah.
background of page 20," and it's like,
Oh my gosh.
okay, sure, whatever works for you.
And it's almost like, at that point, it's like, do you commit to that? Do you just like, want to have these possibilities kind of satisfied with like putting too much into your story? Do you put too little into it? It is it is difficult. Oh my goodness. Um the cat. When I
I
think
planned it all along. Yeah, what about you two?
When I think of hooks for myself, Ghost Junk Sickness was always going to be like the sci-fi that has like a supernatural twist to it. And we kind of hint at certain pages, I guess, in like the beginning, with some superpowers and stuff like that. But it always like talking about the story to people. I always like to include like sci-fi bounty hunters kind of thing because that's always something that's intrigued me. So that's right for myself. But I do see the ears perked up, and then I usually say that it's also going to be featuring some kind of mysterious otherworldly beings and stuff like that, which is very interesting for these kinds of stories. Mostly it's dramas and space fighting and stuff like that, which Ghost Junk has, but having that like I guess presence of supernatural was kind of really cool. And I say that I'm getting excited about it because I've had it time and time again where people say, I actually don't like the sci-fi genre, but the way that you guys tell it and the elements that you use has made me hooked on this genre now, and I can give it a chance because it's different. So I'm always excited about that. So I feel like that's successful. As far as like anything specific, it's always impossible for me to kind of pin down for that. I don't really know exactly why people are hooked with Ghost Junk Sickness. I would plan for certain chapters, which I was pleasantly surprised to hear that some people say that that's when they kind of got invested. So that's cool. But it changes for different people, like we were talking about with Phantom Marine. So it's difficult.
Yeah, Hook as like just the right kind of blend of different genre elements that like complement or subvert one another is definitely very tasty. Um I'm all for the like spooky eldritch supernatural elements in Ghost Junk Sickness, so that was absolutely what hooked me personally.
Me too. That's
Hell
me too.
yes.
Oh
That
yeah.
makes me so happy to hear.
Yeah, I feel like a good a hook for me, like I always think of it as being like something familiar with like a surprise attached. And it's kind of fun sort of figuring these things out kind of as I work on my own stuff because I rarely plan these things going in. I feel like Chiralt has an easier hook to comprehend and sort of encapsulate in a sentence because I've got the teeny tiny little girl main character kind of teamed up with like a grouchy, brooding, kind of badass like monster hunter character in sort of a almost like a lone wolf and cub or Dororo sort of situation, which I think a lot of folks enjoy, including myself. But it ended up in sort of a weird spot where the hook at the beginning was like a lot of fun to play with during the initial episodic chapters, but it's a bit different from the hook that I was most interested in exploring in the later chapters. When I started getting really into Kieran's backstory and the weird eldritch shenanigans that were going on, and that was kind of a mystery that I set up early on, and I think a fair number of readers, I hope, were invested in sort of finding out how that got resolved. And when it comes to Witchwood, it got significantly more complicated because I decided that I wanted a bigger like core cast. I've got 4 main characters instead of just 2, and each one sort of has their own deal, and so there's sort of mini hooks attached to the characters and archetypes that I'm playing with. Like there's different points of appeal that might draw people into the story. but I don't think the really big hook that draws in a more widespread point of interest. I don't think that happens until a certain event in chapter 8 when the new breach opens up, and it's sort of a big moment, sort of undercutting like everything that came before. And it was cool watching like reader reactions to it, and I do feel like that is sort of the point where the real story gets underway, so to speak. So I think that is my hook. My mistake is that I put it 300 pages in. It's a little late when it comes to these things, but I'm happy that I got to it.
I've also seen worse.
True.
Uh, oh gosh, yes. That's the things with hooks though, is that they're always technically present, like whether you intend it or not. Like they vary from reader to reader too. And that's different from like when you're pitching the thing as well. We'll get into that later, but what makes one person stay, maybe the relationship, the dynamics, may not be the same as why another person stayed. Maybe the super science breakdown of magical crystal lore. So I think when you are to describe your hook, you definitely need to understand what the potential is for your story and why a stranger should care to read it. While it differs from a hook you use in your pitch, like I said, versus a reader latched onto this from the moment that impacted them personally, having some knowledge of what you're trying to do to get readers get hyped for is absolutely always a plus.
Yeah, that concept of kind of picking what it is that I want to present to my readers as like a first impression, because hooks aren't necessarily only for advertising. Like we're talking mostly about a hook as in the thing that grabs the reader and makes them stick around, whereas advertising is sort of how you get them to take a look in the first place. But they're closely related because an effective marketing plan will kind of show people the thing that they'll enjoy about the story. And I had a hard time figuring that out for Witchwood because I have 4 characters and each of them has a different thing, and I have different readers who might gravitate towards one or the other. And Tiara is the viewpoint character, so I've got the like hothead fire themed powers and sort of a punk aesthetic, and some folks really like that. But then I've also got Felix, who's like an angsty elf, and a lot of my readers love him. So I'm like, should I try to like spin my pitch to include him, but like he's not kind of the character that kicks off the plot in the biggest way. So it's really hard to figure out a short or like concise pitch that sort of centers that character, or like going in kind of different directions. So it's one of those things where I'm kind of like, well, I'll just focus on kind of one thing, and hopefully people will discover the rest as they read through it and find the thing that they like.
All right. So we've talked about what makes a good hook, at least in terms of our own stories. What makes a hook unsuccessful, whether in our own work or in someone else's?
Well, it's tough too. Just like when we're kind of describing like our own hooks and what to expect, like, it's tough to also describe an ultimately bad hook because you never know. It's subjective, but it still exists. It's and I'm sorry, Thane. This is not a call out. Oh my god.
Wah, wah.
Oh
Uh,
no.
but one of the like bad hook elements to me is something that relies on an element or a plot point that is going to happen way too late in the story.
Yeah.
So something that's gonna happen like 500 pages in, it's like, wait, guys, stay. It's gonna get good. I swear. One of the things that I always think of, especially with webcomics, because webcomic time, is that we have to have pacing in mind, interest in mind, update schedules, blah 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 blah, to keep that engagement and to see, to help the reader kind of get to the end of the point that we want to make, kind of thing. So, I often see in writing circles when people talk about this, they're just like, "Oh, I have to get through the boring parts." And I'm just like, "Why are you writing boring parts? If you're thinking it's boring, then wouldn't the reader think it's boring? You should cut the boring parts." or make it a little bit more entertaining for you to write so that people read it and have fun. So I always think of that. And then in those juicy moments that you write, you're like, wow, what if I'm writing something really special here and it's only in the first chapter, and that's really cool. And then it's a nice build up to get to whatever point you're trying to make. So I think about that a lot. And I think it's just really, really important to kind of think of like how they're reading this, how they're consuming this, how they're understanding your story and stuff like that. Because you don't want to just put all your eggs in one basket for one moment to just get attached to. I think that's pretty dangerous in any kind of medium too.
I think there's also something important about hooks where you can't attach too much, I guess, very specific information about your world, about your characters. Like the more you start dropping like place names or character names, or like in the year 306 there was an asteroid strike, it's like, actually that kind of sounds cool, I don't know. um but it's something where like, I don't know, you have to put yourself in the mindset of somebody who really doesn't know much about your world and kind of focus on almost like a primal, like what would surprise somebody? What would, I guess, yeah, like if you showed it to your mom, would she be like, "Oh, that's surprising. What happens next?" Like there's, I think there's some stories where you kind of get tunnel vision about like, oh, I love my character, he's my blorbo and he's my favorite, I love him, and everybody's gonna get so excited when he dies, and it's like, we don't know who he is yet. Like you have a lot of work to do before we can care about this character. In your mind it might be the ultimate hook, but to a complete stranger who's coming into your world, they might need more information before you drop that hook. I guess it's something you could do early on and then give context later, and then people can retroactively be like, oh, that was terrible. But it is something I see where it's kind of like the hook that you think is a hook but isn't. Like, or it could be one. Like every hook can be kind of cool in a vacuum, but it really does matter where you put it in the story and what you surround it with. So you do need that kind of, that sense of like, I have enough breadcrumbs to understand why this is significant and then go forward from there.
All context.
I think about my time when I was tabling, and I was beside this one person who was pitching their work to strangers because you do that. And I remember the most like frustrating way that this guy was trying to pitch his work was that he was using only comparative works, and I couldn't remember the name of his title. The title of his comic, I couldn't even remember what it was about because the only thing that he was shouting was that if you like Futurama and if you like Star Trek, you're gonna like my comic. And I'm just like,
Oh
but
no.
what are you saying? What is your comic called? Like, I don't even know what it's about. Like, maybe I do like Star Trek and Futurama, but like to me, it's nothing sticking and it's not even getting me interested because to this day I don't remember anything. I only remember Futurama and Star Trek. So I think like understanding how to word those things so that you can add the comparative works comes later or something like that. So that's something that I like to kind of pay attention to when you're trying to get people hooked on your stuff or say the hook. Another example is when, you know, that you are describing your work, kind of the same method. And they're just like, you know, oh yeah, my story's about rainbow cat stuff. And then, you know, have you seen, I don't know, Full Metal Alchemist? Yeah. And you're just like, what are you saying? Is this the hook that it's going to be like the story? Or so really understanding what it is exactly that you're trying to say from something that you're taking from some inspiration or something like that, and extracting that, putting that into your work, and the words that you use to kind of like get people enticed.
Yeah, I always wonder sometimes when it comes to those pitches that are so focused on comparative works, like can as an exercise, what if folks just came up with a description that was so like tonally perfect for their story that somebody to whom they gave that description, that person being spoken to would think, "Oh, like Star Trek and Futurama kind of." Like you want that feeling, like that vibe, to be communicated by at least the work itself, if not in the pitch itself or the description, like, because that's something that has to actually live within the story for it to land. You can't just tell me that it's gonna thrill me or amuse me like a Pratchett novel or something like that. I've got to feel it and experience it. Honestly, I feel like I have trouble picking comparatives, but if I ever did actually mention one, it would probably be something that someone else told me my work reminded them of, rather than me kind of picking it on the fly.
I like how one of my worst comparatives is Pirates of the Caribbean without pirates. It's just like like I already lose. Why am I even doing this? But I don't know. Like that was I remember having a meeting with a friend of mine who was just like, "Okay, you're going to sit down here and you're going to tell me what your comic is about," because I was getting ready for VanCaf and I'm like, "I really don't know." And I think I said Pirates of the Caribbean without pirates and she was just like, "You have to do better than that." And I'm like, "No, I can't." But then other people over the years have given rough comparisons that have helped, but I still never rely on it because it's like, again, like you said, like there's never going to be somebody who remembers it and then is able to Google it based on it's like Futurama. Like a bunch of other things are like Futurama now. That tells me nothing. You have to give me something different, something like you don't have to do you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but just something that makes me think, "Oh, it's that comic. Of course it's that comic."
The one with the blue spaceship with the baseball hat, whose name is Steve, who killed Santa Claus. You know, that one.
I would read that.
BRB, starting my new comic.
That's probably only one comic.
And it's Thane's side hustle.
But yeah, it's got it should be memorable, if nothing else, if somebody like walks away from the comic and then is trying to describe it to their friends later on. Hopefully, like, that'll be the thing that they talk about. And speaking of the things that people will tell their friends when they're trying to get them to read the thing, that thing that Crispy was saying earlier about that, like, just give the story a chance, it gets good later. Like, when you leave the pitch too late, you it will change the way, like, people recommend it, because sometimes they'll kind of realize, like, oh, the beginning of it was a little, like, it was a little dull, I almost gave it up, or I wouldn't have kept going if it weren't for a strong recommendation from someone else, but I want to save my friend that pain, so they'll say start with chapter 5. uh as a specific example, I'm going to cite Homestuck, because start with chapter 5 was something that a lot of people were telling each other at the time, that it was at the peak of its popularity, because that was the point where a lot of the most memorable and interesting and fun elements of the story, like the trolls and the stuff about the asteroids and all the crazy, like, interdimensional stuff, when all of those reveals started dropping at the same time and you were learning about all these new awesome characters, that became like the story in a lot of people's memories, and so a lot of the conversation about it, like, the fandom was divided into people who were like, I read the whole beginning, did you? Because so many of the newcomers would only start with chapter 5 and would just not never bother to go back and read the beginning. And it is like, when it comes to webcomics, because so many are like, written as the creator is discovering them for themselves, and that is not, it's not really a bad thing. Like, if you're working on your story for the first time ever, like, obviously you should do what feels right for you creatively and, like, find your way. And if the way to learn how to make webcomics is to just make a webcomic, like, I would never say, like, wait, stop until you get good. You're not going to get good unless you do it. But it is worth kind of being aware of where the interest points are going to be, and try to put them in sooner rather than later, like, as you think about them. Don't like try to fill the story with padding, because I need to develop it a bit more. uh on some level, I feel like this might also be related to how many creators are inspired by animated shows and like novels and things like that that can afford to have an absolutely enormous scope. And so as a webcomic creator, you might be starting your story and charting out all these like plot beats and thinking like, oh, the big like betrayal twist or something like that. And in the anime that I watch, that would happen in episode 18 out of 25. So you feel like you need to come up with 18 episodes worth of like other content to happen before that point, because it's important that the characters already be fully developed and that they've had a lot of adventures together to like help make it land. But in a webcomic, you can't. It's just not physically possible to make 18 animated show episodes worth of other content. You sort of have to get to the goods quicker.
I think it can help to kind of think of like, if you want to get to that big, like heart-stopping adventure where your characters suffer a great loss, or get half of them die, or they lose a fight for the first time, like think of each adventure beforehand as having its own hook. Like every arc of a manga, like One Piece has arcs that go on for dozens of chapters at a time, and each one kind of has its own hook. So it's something where if the idea of getting to that big showstopper moment intimidates you, think about mini stories leading up to it. I know I absolutely have the problem where I have like the big thing that's way in the future that I want to get to more than anything, and it's almost like when I get to it, I don't know what I'm going to do with myself because I've done all this stuff beforehand. Um, I'm still excited for it, but I have had to kind of not really invent hooks, but more so take all the things that I wanted to include in the story, whether it was visuals or dialogue choices or scenes between characters, where I was just like, this is like a mini hook that will keep somebody going. Like, it's not necessarily like a page ending on a cliffhanger line every single time, but it is almost like a waypoint on that pathway towards that big, massive blow up. So, yeah, I think a lot of people they think of this webcomic journey as kind of this, oh, it's this plotting thing until I can finally get to what I want. And honestly, at that point, I would just say, get to what you want. Like, you can make it a short comic. You can establish character development in very little time. Like, you might surprise yourself if you were excited for that big thing. Get to that big thing earlier. I certainly have forced myself to do it because I've realized that that's just kind of what keeps me going, and I can. Like, there's nothing wrong with it if you can justify it with the information that you were able to convey. I know not everybody can do that, but I've absolutely just been like, I don't want to spend 30 years on this thing. I don't want to spend, dozens of pages just kind of sitting around in taverns or anything. I want a little hook almost every 20 or 30 pages. I guess one every chapter or so. It's important for me to have.
I think that's such a great idea and such a great way of thinking about it, and something that I feel like I've been trying to consider when it comes to my own stories when I'm writing in like a chapter that is taking place kind of in between major events or something like that, where I feel like I need kind of downtime, but on my outline sheet, like it's kind of in between two big things. Um, but I feel like I need the space. There are things that you can kind of use to create those mini hooks with regards to, in particular, like the characters and the world building, because those tend to be major interest points for your readers. And if you look at what the next plot beat is, like which characters is it going to involve, who might be taking like a backseat, maybe you can work in some extra development for some of the characters and like show the reader like a little surprise or like something new about them, like a different side to their character, and kind of treat it like a study which can have its own hook and build towards the ones that come later. because often the things that you might feel like you need to build the context for like a huge plot point coming up later. Like, how do you make it the most impactful? Like, say, earlier I mentioned, like, oh, it's a betrayal twist. Like, what about the betrayal is going to make it hit the hardest? Like, you really want to kind of understand, like, it's definitely a character centric moment. So making sure the reader understands the characters is going to be so important for getting that spot to land. Like, just set up like what the dynamic is, maybe give it a little like twist, maybe like strengthen it, give the impression that like one of the characters thinks that there's more trust there than there actually is, or like a little hint. Do you want to tell the reader that something is coming, or do you want it to completely blindside them? Because you can support either of those positions in the preceding chapters, and kind of coming at it from that angle might help to focus the content that comes before, even if you can't like cut it or whatever.
All right. So, discussing about, talking about the hooks of our story, making an unsuccessful hook. So, how do we make a hook that's stronger? How do we make a good hook?
I think the biggest thing for me is moving it forward. Move it almost as far forward as you can. Um, just on a practical level, I think, some stories, they survive the it gets better later, or just wait until chapter 5 thing, but there's a lot of people don't really have that sense of time, or they don't have somebody actively telling them, like, you have to have the story stand on its own. You can't rely on other people constantly to advocate for it, I guess. So I don't know. There's a combination of things that bother me in terms of hooks, where oftentimes it comes really late, um, and it doesn't need to. Like, I think if you use your time economically, and if you establish who your characters are, and you establish why we should care about them, and then something happens to them, like, even if they're just talking, they're being sweet to each other, they're a good group, and you don't want anything bad to happen to them, and then something bad happens, like, that can happen in like a 10-page mini comic on Twitter. Like that, there's people that can convey that sense of, oh gosh, this just stabbed me in the heart, or oh, I would want another, 300 pages of this story. We had a really cool event in the last couple of months where we it was organized by Hiveworks, where we had a challenge to make a 4-page mini comic and literally put it on Twitter. And the number of people that were able to make a really coherent, meaningful, affecting story in only 4 pages was staggering. Like, it was amazing. A lot of people, they don't realize you can elicit emotions rather quickly without much context. So I think that's my bit of advice. Like, if you feel tempted to push it, I think if it goes more than maybe 50 pages, I think I start getting worried. If it's like, where's the hook? I don't feel it. Where's the hook? I don't know what's happening. Like, there's exceptions, of course, but I think in terms of that, I would like to see it pretty quickly, and I think that's best for everybody if you structure it pretty well.
Thinking about like being in spaces where you have a lot of writers, have a lot of webcomic creators, I always see them kind of so hesitant about such juicy details that I think that they should just start with. Just start with these juicy details that they're just like, but it's a spoiler that happens in chapter 2. And I'm just like, that's chapter 2 of your 84 chapter webcomic, my friend. I think that it's good if you give us these juicy details now, so that we understand what we're in for as far as the ride is concerned, kind of thing. um
Yeah, and it's something where you can give enough details to
yes,
create a question in someone's mind, but not everything either. So
yes.
there's a lot of flexibility there that I think a lot of people don't afford themselves.
I love that you said that, create a question in their head. It's just, that's so prime, that's so perfect. Like, make the readers question why they're here, why they're reading. Like, oh, this character did that. Why? I'm interested now. I'm here because I want to know. I want to have these questions answered and stuff like that. So, it comes from a lot of that kind of reflecting. Workshopping, hearing other people talk about your story, things that you're kind of going for, will help. Oftentimes, I ask for help with our newer story, Lunar Blight. And, when we were workshopping that and finding out the synopsis, it was so nice to be like, oh man, we were holding on to these details that were so vague and just not interesting. And just saying them makes it so much better. And that was relieving, honestly, to understand my work after that too, being like, oh, these are the details that make the work. I shouldn't be holding them so close to my chest. It's not something that's going to break the story as far as like a spoiler is concerned, with the structure, but like, these are things to look forward to as a reader. So, you always want to be asking, like, why are these people reading your work? Is there a particular moment of the story that changes the tides, a dynamic that you've been, hard at work with, something that happens on a page to keep interest? It all depends on the work, of course, the pacing, the way that you want to present it, the format too, because I know that something like webtoons, with the scroll that they have, the episodes are different from page format. So it's just like, some of this advice is harder to parse and apply, depending on that. But it's just, this is, it's interesting to know how to break that down, and understand, why are we here for this long ride? How do we keep people here? And, like Claire said, ask those questions.
Yeah, I have heard the concept of a hook been described as like creating urgent questions, and I do think that's a really good way of putting it, because that's the definition of a page turner, right? Like, you're constantly asking, what happens next? What happens next? Um, Something that actually, that micro comic challenge with the 4 pages on Twitter was such a good exercise in like figuring out what the hook was for like the short story that I wanted to tell, because you really have to think about it as like, to make a short story. The idea is that, somebody who doesn't know a single thing about your work can read it and understand like what you're going for. Like, it tells a complete little story that is its own hook. And it was such a good exercise in thinking about that. And I wanted to do a short story that was set in like the setting of Witchwood, using the characters from the comic. But I had to find a way to tell a story that would be interesting, I guess, for people who might not have read the comic and might not know anything about them. And trying to figure out like what a hook was when I couldn't couch it in like the framework of my comics plot or anything like that was it was tricky at first. What I ended up going with was the post-apocalyptic setting itself, because that can be a hook. I kind of turned that into sort of the punchline, so to speak, of the story itself. And it seemed to work really well, because that concept is something that can be familiar to the reader, even if you don't know a single thing about the specific post-apocalyptic world that I've set up. Just the concept of an apocalypse happened is something that a lot of readers these days are familiar with. It's become such a big genre. And I think that's something that is important when it comes to the most, like, a lot of really powerful hooks. You kind of have to be able to break them down in a way that is familiar. So like a character beat is really good for this, because if it's dealing with emotions that like readers themselves feel, that makes it relatable. Like, you understand what it is, even if there's all this other crazy high concept sci-fi fantasy magic funky stuff flying around. The basic emotions at play should be something that are grounded, to make it like to give it that like strength in the reader's mind, I guess. And when it comes to building up like world building, a lot of that is you kind of start from a place that is familiar, and you slowly add in elements that are unfamiliar, and then you start to slide in the surprises. But you kind of need to have that groundwork laid down. And if you open with too much completely unfamiliar stuff, that's where you lose the readers. Like, I cannot even count the number of comics that open with, like, in the beginning, the gods made the world, and then the gods fought, and then they died, and they left behind a prophecy, and then the prophecy, like, presumably there's a hook somewhere in there about, like, oh, the main character is related to the prophecy. But a whole bunch of, like, random names that I don't recognize have just been thrown at me, and I haven't actually remembered any of them. So the story is kind of still starting from, like, ground zero, even after the prologue, which is sort of it's a tricky place to come from.
I think it, like, definitely, like, you have to be invested in the terminology before you can even, like, give a poot about the Blim Blams are doing the great Bardokian War of the year 28 million against the, you know, I don't know, medieval court of the Blamblochians, whatever. You know, it doesn't mean anything to you because there's not that investment. There's not that, you know, initial, you know, ground to care about that stuff. So definitely be kind of, you know, wary about when you place stuff like that. You know, use kind of more basic descriptors for people to understand, and even that, it's not going to be everybody's cup of tea.
It actually makes me wonder now if anybody has been hooked directly by the little caption I added on my new first page, which is, I think it's, yeah, 5,000 years after the fracture. Like, what is the fracture? That sounds bad. It sounds like there's a lot of things that got broken. Maybe let's figure it out what's going on there. So I don't know. It's a lot of, you know, using terminology, using things that people are familiar with. You can immediately start telling somebody something's up here. Here are the puzzle pieces. You can recognize what the puzzle pieces colors are and what they might be depicting, but essentially it's kind of drawing you into it with something that you already like or already recognize or can already say, you know, I think I know what this is going to be like.
You know, I love that you say that because I'm like, we did the same thing.
It's a good thing. It's good.
Ain't no shame.
Yeah. There's a reason why I named a lot of my, like, funky stuff in Witchwood just, like, the most bland, like, terms. My magic system, it's just called magic. That's
Hell
it.
yes.
You don't need
Where
anything else. It's fine.
Yeah.
that gets the idea across. I say it, and you already know kind of what I mean. Like, you know, the thing the aliens came through, it's the breach. People know what a breach is. I don't have to give it a fancy name. I could,
I like
but
that.
I didn't.
The
Oh.
Dorito.
Yeah, that's its name. It's the Dorito. That's my true hook.
They just open a file. It's like, why is this code named the Dorito? Well, that's
I
the
mean,
funny
look
story.
at it. It's a question that answers itself.
Oh my god.
Anyway, read Witchwood.
Do you like Doritos?
You like Monster Energy drinks?
This is very serious. This is very serious talk. Yes.
Seriously, cereal.
Oh, this cannot be cut. Keep this in.
No. Yes.
So, talking about all of this with hooks, how to get successful ones, unsuccessful ones, the way that we put them in the story, I do want to kind of ask, what are hooks that we really, really love? I know for myself, I was absolutely hooked on the webcomic Bicycle Boy. The beginning, actually, right away, hooked me immediately. It's completely silent through many pages, and you're going with the character Poet, who wakes up and they're in all of these kind of dead bodies all around in the middle of nowhere, gets on you know, their little journey, eventually finds the bicycle. You're just like, oh heck yes, we're getting some kind of title drop here, and then, you know, it kind of continues. And, you know, even from those, you know, immediate pages, I was just like, oh, we're starting with questions already. Okay, I'm here. All right, subscribed. Also helps that the style is absolutely beautiful, so it drew me in right away. I love that kind of sci-fi grungy aesthetic look, but yes, immediately Bicycle Boy 100%. What about you two?
I have two examples. One's from a webcomic, and one is from a novel, actually. The webcomic one is probably very well known. It's the opening pages of The Meek. Um, you're in a beautiful green forest, and everything is gorgeous and peaceful, and the art is absolutely beautiful. And then within a couple pages, a girl runs through the scene completely butt naked, and you don't know why. You have absolutely no idea why. So you're immediately just like, okay, you have my attention, story. What are you going to do with this? I always thought that was absolutely fantastic, and I think a lot of other people did too. My novel example is from a story that I remember one of my teachers read us in, I think it was like second or third grade. It was a novel that came out in the 90s called Running Out of Time. The initial the hook is right at the end of the first chapter. It's a very short first chapter. Essentially the story goes, it's, I think it's like 1845 or so, in a little village in the middle of nowhere, kind of, dark, very rustic, and a mother and a daughter are running away from something. It's like they're trying to escape, and you're immediately like, what's going on? I have absolutely no idea. And then by the time that they essentially get to the edge of this town, the mother looks at the daughter and is basically saying, we're in danger here. There's so many things that are threatening us. You need to leave this town to get help. And the daughter is like, okay, I can do that. But the mother just immediately says, I want to warn you, though. In here, it is 1845. Out there, it is 1996. And immediately, I was just like, okay, that's what? And it turns out that she lives in essentially a historical reenactment, but doesn't realize it. Like a whole town that is kept under a certain level of secrecy, where essentially a lot of people in the town are getting sick, and because of historical accuracy, they're not bringing in medicine for them, and it's a whole conspiracy. But in that line of like, in here 1845, out there 1996, I have not been able to forget it for, I guess, going on 25 years now. It is really strong.
Incredible. Holy
That
heck,
is
that
so good.
shivers. Wow.
It's a great line. I also have two examples. One is the webcomic Kill 6 Billion Demons, which opens up with the main character having a very awkward first time sexual encounter, and then in the middle of it, a huge horde of demons just busts through the wall and just swarms through the room. It's very crazy and surprising, and like the art style is like really really wild and vibrant, and you're just immediately like, what the heck is going on? And the tone of the comic kind of maintains this really fast-paced clip kind of as it goes through, and it sets up like the early onset of like wild violence and body horror very quickly too. So warning for that for anybody who wants to check out that comic. My second example is also from a novel, which also has stuck in my mind for like 20 plus years after the first time that I read it. It was in the beginning of Philip Reeve's Mortal Engines series, and I picked up the first book kind of on a whim in the library, and just the first line alone was like the thing that I was like, all right, I need to know more about this. The line goes, "It was a dark, blustery afternoon in spring, and the city of London was chasing a small mining town across the dried out bed of the old North Sea." There's just a lot going on there. So
What?
yeah. I mean, the book is about like basically this like crappy dystopian post-apocalypse future where like humans turned cities into these sort of mobile units, like mount them up on tank treads, and they would like roam around these vast wastelands, like the big cities would chase down smaller ones and cannibalize them for parts and like take in their people and like assimilate them into their own populations. It's just this crazy like Mad Max thing, but like with a whole city instead of like a single car. Is a wild ride. And yeah, so that's those are my hook examples. I feel like most webcomics are not quite lucky enough to have such an immediate hook as those, and they do require a bit more reading. But the nice thing is that vibes can be a hook all on their own. If people enjoy the vibes, they'll just keep going.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's pretty
Luckily
tough
for me.
thinking about like webcomics in all of this. And there's a lot of aspects to kind of keep in mind when you're writing it, when you're, you know, designing characters, when you're uploading it, where to upload it, how to upload it, how to read it, how to, you know, blah 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 blah. So a lot of it can feel very very overwhelming, but I did want to just underline the fact that it's just a lot of this is something that you will figure out either along the way or, you know, with a nice little beta group or anything like that. Like, you know, it is there because it's there because you're writing it for a reason, and you just need to get that reason to you know, readers and uncover what the hook is for you so that, you know, they can get excited and read it and then get invested too, kind of thing. And with that, I think that is an excellent Chicken Salad Caesar wrap. I have been Crispy, and you could read my work at ghostjunksickness.com and lunarblight.com.
And I have been Verathane, and you can read my work at tiralt.sevensmith.net or witchwoodcomic.com.
And I have been Claire Clam. You can read my work at phantomarine.com.
Attention! My story contains story elements. That's my hook.
Thank you for listening to Screen Tones, a webcomic podcast. Want to know some other ways to support us? Check out our Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/screentonescast, where your support will help us create more episodes, reach cool extra bonus goals, and keep us talking about anything and everything webcomics. You can also find us on Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and our Discord server. Thank you so much for listening, sharing, rating, and supporting, and we'll see you next time.